we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time watching, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always say, if you ever wanted to reach out to the podcast, you want to let us know anything about anything, you want to give us a shout, you want to give us a critique, you want to give us an idea for a new podcast, you want to be a guest on the show, don't hesitate to reach out to us on our DMs at the Bigmark podcast, at the Bigmark pod. Again, thank you so much for being here tonight. If you do like the podcast, please rate it. Please share it with your friends. If you're watching on YouTube, like the video and subscribe to the channel. And check out our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpod, and donate to the podcast there. I'm really excited again about tonight's episode. Always, as always, I'm going down the Tim Dillon, the Giannis Pappas, the Chris DiStefano route. They said on a podcast once, there will one day be podcasts about podcasts. And here we are again on the Bigmark pod, talking about this other wicked podcast I've been listening to lately. It's been around for a while now. It came out kind of during COVID, or it really hit its stride during COVID. And it's funny, the hosts of it joke that, you know, at some points when people were, worrying about necessarily how long things were going to last, they were almost hoping it was going to last longer just because how well things are going for them. Again, they're obviously joking. These guys are great. These guys are hilarious. The hosts of Are You Garbage podcast, comedian, this is their self-proclaimed description. Comedians H. Foley and Kevin Ryan are self-proclaimed garbage. Each week a guest puts I don't know, I'm doing this voice. Each week a guest puts to the test. Each week a guest gets put to the test to determine if they are in fact garbage as well. It's like a trashy comedy game show. And again, obviously the perfect description as given by the owners themselves. It's a really interesting podcast because, again, it has that kind of more structured feel to it. However, it feels really laid back. I mean, like, obviously if you've listened to my podcast before, you know, things are pretty loose. On these solo ones, most of the time I like to do a topic which just kind of keeps things like kind of reined in, but more or less I'm just kind of, you know, expanding on ideas, expanding on notes and things like that. And or expanding on the point to the story, I should say. But with guests, I like to be completely open and just kind of let the conversation go naturally. And yes, obviously, if that person tends to be an expert in their field of study, it tends to kind of come up in conversation naturally, just because that's just how fucking conversations work. But obviously there's other podcasts out there that kind of, you know, they have, without putting too fine a point on it, they have more structure. But again, there's something more to the podcast, whether it's a gimmick, whether it's a little bit more interview based, where they do have a series of questions, or, you know, hot ones, for instance, where, you know, everything's kind of set up in a sense where the guests on the podcast are going through the similar experience, but then the host kind of creates the story, creates the questions surrounding them. And again, it kind of just really at the end of the day kind of just depends on what you want out of the podcast and what you want to learn about the guest of the podcast too, right? Like, again, I've always taken I've always taken that example, look towards Joe Rogan as the inspiration for the long form, where, again, anything can happen. And don't get me wrong, I don't know if I've even really come close to some of his like 3-hour plus podcasts, but I've touched 2 hours at least. I know Jeremy and I definitely went pretty long, which was awesome. And again, it's allows for so much space in the conversation for anything to happen. And I find you learn more about the guests that way rather than structured questioning. But with the Are You Garbage Boys, it's not necessarily hard hitting to get down to the bottom of it. It's kind of a funny, or it's not kind of, it's a hilarious approach to kind of getting down into the history and the past of some comedians and actors, and I don't know if they've had musicians yet, but it's basically all comedians that are guests as well. Well, I guess they've had like Dr. Drew and things, but like anyway, people that are like adjacent to the comedy world. And again, they ask a series of questions on ranging topics. Like literally, I'm pretty sure they come up with questions the day of. And I think at this point, because I've been around for so many years now, I think Patreon members like send in questions and things like that. So they're constantly kind of generating different questions, and they've had questions roll over to different from past podcasts and roll over into current ones. And I think it's really cool because again, you get that whole bespoke aspect. Essentially, they're making it specifically for that person, and you can kind of tell as they're asking questions. They tend to, when they get a guest on, they already have an idea maybe of whether they're going to be garbage or classy is the opposite. And it's, I guess, like trashy and garbage are synonyms here. So if you call someone garbage, it's the same thing as calling them trashy. So the opposite being classy. I think they tend to ask the host, they ask the guest right off the bat whether they think themselves to be classy or trashy. And then they kind of proceed from there, and you can tell that they're kind of editing on the fly and crossing out questions that they were going to ask and things like that. And those two boys happen to be H. Foley and Kevin Ryan. Again, like I mentioned, really interesting comedians, New York-based comedians, both of them. And I think, like many podcast hosts, they are comedians, like many podcast hosts, I should say. And I think that always just lends itself to talking and generating, shit on the fly and continuing to like kind of riff off the cuff and not take too many breaks, and obviously also make it funny too. And simultaneously promoting their own medium, their own podcast, their own stand-up dates, things like that when they're getting on the road. H. Foley, New York-based comedian, a.k.a. Henry Foley. I don't think he wants anyone to know that, though, because he goes by H. Foley. From Philly originally, and he's about 45 years old right now. I wish I knew more about these cats. There's only so much info out there, boys. You guys are keeping it close to the vest. And Kevin Ryan, a.k.a. Kippy. Again, another New York-based comedian, also from Philly, 34 years old. He's a couple years older than myself, so... sounds like this. And again, these guys are a couple East Coast guys. They're from Philly. They're living in New York City. They're just like relatable guys. I don't know what it is. It's funny. Like what is it about, at least myself anyway, what is it about East Coast Americans that's just something's fascinating? I don't know what it is. Like, especially from New York City. I think it's the New York thing, but it's the accent. It's the attitude, it's the sayings, it's everything, right? And these guys are from Philly, so they don't necessarily have like a New York accent, but they have that like Philadelphia wooder, go down to the wooder and go home and get a cheesesteak and go home and down and answer the phone. They just have like an interesting, it's like, funny enough, they broke it down on Our Garbage recently, and it's kind of like there's like almost like they're borderline Australian. It's really interesting the way the accent. It's bizarre accent. So hard to. I've tried to dissect it a couple times, where I've been like, what exactly is it about the East Coast attitude? Again, I think there's something about where I think Hollywood and everything, it really like portrays a West Coast ideal of things. I mean, with Hollywood being in LA, I think there's this idea like that's where a lot of the sets are, that's where a lot of the settings are, so it tends to kind of give that vibration. And even a lot of the shows that we would love, that we'd think are set in the East Coast, are actually just on film lots in Hollywood, like Seinfeld. We love Seinfeld. None of that shit is filmed on location. That's all filmed on sets in a studio lot on NBC like studios, so which is in Hollywood, California. So again, it's all smoke and mirrors and what have you, but I think sometimes you get used to that kind of sunny California disposition and you kind of want something more. And I don't know, I mean, being from Ontario, being from, close to Toronto, we're this weird vibration in Canada where Canada, if you're going to compare us to the States, you can almost compare our entire country like to like the Midwest of America. So you think we kind of be like more similar to Chicago or things like that. And don't get me wrong, there's pieces of that in Toronto. But I heard Will Sasso, actually another great, I mentioned him before in our podcast about 10-minute podcast. Again, another podcast about a podcast. We're getting very meta on the Bigmark podcast today. Anyway, he was talking about Toronto is almost like a European New York, which is an interesting critique. It's an interesting commentary, I should say. But yeah, again, we're not far from New York City, 8 hours about drive. And like, I think it's like an hour and a bit flight. Nothing, no big deal. So we're not far from New York City. And there's obviously a romanticization. I think you probably talk to anyone in the world, there's something romantic. We love New York City. It is the capital of the world. It's this interesting, there's such a, like, we fucking build pyramids and shit in random places in the world. And I think we build pyramids or we build statues and monuments and big fucking temples and shit in places that made you feel like whatever New York City makes you feel. I don't know what it is. I think it's an ancient fucking primordial feeling. I don't know, just because there's so many fucking bloody people there right now. Even though there's other super cities in the world, it's very strange. New York City, it's a place like, I've been lucky to be there a couple times in my childhood. I haven't been there in my life, but it's one of those places where like I long to be in a place where I've never been, and that's always a strange feeling. And again, there's something just that intrigues, at least, and maybe I'm just speaking for myself. Maybe some people think that fucking shit is annoying as fuck, and those accents are weird as shit. So who knows? Again, I think New York City being, or the East Coast of America anyway, being like the spot where a lot of people when they were leaving Europe were coming over and kind of landing on the East Coast and things like that. I think that has a little bit of the allure potentially to myself. Coming from immigrant ancestry, where my grandparents came over and, You know, they had choices like where my grandmother, she said when she came to Canada, I think she landed in Halifax, to be honest, on a boat. To be honest, I don't know. But it was somewhere on the east coast of Canada, and they were like, you can go to Chicago, or you could go, I think Hamilton might have been on the list, or Red Lake, Ontario was on the list. Anyway, or she was following my grandfather. But again, you get all these choices when you make there. So like Chicago was a big place where a lot of Lithuanians went. You know, it was just like New York City was the stopping place. A lot of people landed there and where they were just like, fuck it, here we are. We're staying here. We're not going much further. Maybe we'll go to Jersey. Maybe we'll go down to Philly. Some of us went up to Quebec. So, like, again, like, the East Coast has that immigrant vibe, which, again, a lot of Eastern European immigrants live there, and I think that speaks to it, you know, the food, the accent, the attitudes, again. I think some of that speaks to it. And, you know, I grew up also in Hamilton. There's a lot of Italians here in Hamilton that I grew up with, and knowing them and knowing their families and things like that really speaks to me, and maybe that's why I romanticize the East Coast so much. But again, it's funny because the Are You Garbage podcast might also be called, and this is self-proclaimed by H. Foley and Kippy himself. They say the Are You Garbage podcast might also be called Are Your Parents Immigrants podcast, because again, they're sadly, I don't know if this is sad, but it's sometimes hard to distinguish whether you are trash or you're just like an immigrant and you just don't know what's fucking classy and you just do what you fucking do. So I always thought that was a hilarious take. And again, like, they have guests, and they also do solo-ish, but it's two guys, so it's not fucking solo, but they sans guest. But again, anytime they have a guest, they have these questions, like I mentioned before, and they go through each question, and, you know, you can tell that maybe some of the answers are kind of like, you know, guiding their questioning. Some of them are just kind of like, oh, I just want to ask this fucking question. Like, some of them are hilarious. I mean, I'm pretty sure, if they haven't, I'm pretty sure they're working on like a card game of this, like a game you can play at home with it. But I'm sure you could just like follow along and play along with it sometimes. But like, some of the examples, and a few of the examples are just like from their fucking their own bloody description. And then some were off like some episodes that I saw comments and things like that. Like, one of the questions is, do you steal hotel shampoo? I do. Do you own a George Foreman grill? Have you ever worn Jenko jeans? Do you consider yourself a fan of a minor baseball team? And I think that one's, you know, that shit's funny because, like, I was just thinking about this the other day. Like, you know, you kind of have like if there's a hierarchy of sports, you know, you kind of have like the big four, the big five, however you want to look at it. You know, you have Major League Baseball, you have the National Basketball Association, you have the National Football League, you have National Hockey League, and then Major League Soccer. So, you know, it's kind of like the major five there, if you want to look at it that way. But even soccer kind of spills into this like kind of second tier, where you have like Champions League and all like that British, you know, American soccer, or sorry, British European soccer, I should say. And, you know, that you start to like encapsulate kind of other sports in that, and like, you know, really, other than those, there's not many others that are like really like 100% televised all the time. You might get like some World Cups here or there, and then like under that you start to get into like bar sports. You start to get into like billiards and darts and fucking shuffleboards and shit. It's fucking wild. So again, I feel like as soon as you start stepping out of like at least those top 2 tiers, things start to get pretty trashy as you go down there. So I always thought that was a funny one about the minor baseball teams. Do you give scratch off lottery tickets as a gift? Hilarious. I thought that's pretty funny because sometimes I get those. These ones are a little bit more specific. Have you ever clogged up a Coinstar machine? If you guys don't know what a Coinstar machine is, just one of those machines like at a grocery store that you can put your fucking coins in and it'll give you money back for a fee. I think I did it once, and it takes like a significant chunk out of your Porsche, out of your change. And like when you're collecting change, even if it takes like $10, that's a good chunk. Like you probably don't have much more than like $100 in change, hopefully. But imagine clogging one up. Like you're just using it so much. You're just fucking putting so much change in this thing that this thing clogs, and then you're in the grocery store in front of everybody. Imagine. Have you ever spent less than $5 in gas? I thought that was pretty trashy. It's like, I feel like I've been there though. I don't know. Some of these things are just struggle city hilarious. Do you own a flag made of bottle caps? Tremendous. I thought that was funny. I think I came up, or I was thinking of coming up with some. I don't know. How many times a week do you get Tim Hortons? I always thought that one's a tough one though, because like sometimes it's just like the coffee shop in your neighborhood. But if you go out of your way and you have to alter your schedule to get Tim Hortons, that's trash. Was any of your home furniture not actually furniture? So like, was your kitchen table like made out of like an old like cable reel? Or was like your like bed frame like actually a bunch of milk cartons? I don't know, some shit like that. Work with me here, people. How many uncles or aunts do you have that aren't actually aunts or uncles? Not bad, not very hard hitting, but hey, you get keep it going, you keep it rocking. That's how we do it on the Are You Garbage podcast featuring Bigmark. So again, those are like the kind of questions you're getting, and you know, it's really funny because I think some of their guests come on and they're like, they kind of want to avoid being known that they're garbage, or they want to be classy. And again, a lot of the kind of parameters of the show is that it's, are they trash, or are they garbage, or are they classy right then and there sitting in the room. It's not like, were you garbage or were you trash if you grew up trash. I mean, a lot of times once you're trash, you're always trash. But like, again, there's just this whole field of them, you know. Again, there's a detective aspect from H. Foley and Kevin. There's something where they're really trying to get to know someone and really trying to get down into the nitty gritty and really feel somebody out, and because they're self-proclaimed garbage, right? Like they're not trying to hide it from anyone. They're not, their hands aren't clean. You know, they haven't cleaned their hands in the wooter. They're out there. They're doing their thing. And, you know, I think they're one of those podcasts where they have a great Patreon. You should go check out their Patreon. The Are You Garbage podcast. I'm pretty sure it's Are You Garbage on Patreon. Hold on, I should look it up if I'm actually gonna promote it. But I think it's one of those things where, you know, they genuinely want to get to know their, and you know, again, their fellow Patreon, or sorry, their fellow patrons, patreon.com/areyougarbage. Yeah, patreon.com/areyougarbage. Go check it out. But again, there's a sleuth aspect where, again, they're trying to figure this out. They're trying to get down into the nitty gritty and really understand their guests. And by finding out whether they're garbage or not, it really gets deep, because, like I said, some of these comedians are trying to avoid it, but it really opens them up. It reminds them. It plays on nostalgia, like we always mention on this podcast. Nostalgia is so strong, but all these things kind of all accumulate into just really, really interesting content, right? And you can tell that Kippy and H. Foley are really good friends, and that's super special. And I really appreciate watching that, and I think it's really cool seeing that, because, again, I used to have Christian Aubin as my producer. He did a great job. He created the intro. He helped do a lot of the graphic design, and I love him and I miss him, and I wish he was still part of the show. But there are times where I do also wish I had someone else in front of the camera too, right? Like, again, I have these topics, I have these notes and things that I can work off when I'm doing solo, and I can figure it out. And it is very free to be completely alone. And yeah, maybe it seems kind of wild and nuts that I'm just kind of talking to myself right now, but I know y'all listening. I know there's just a few of you out there that are listening. Thank you again. But there is only, there's only so much that you can kind of like sometimes create out of the bag, especially if you're having an off night, especially if you're feeling weird, whatever, bad day, long day, just not feeling it, whatever it might be. Sometimes it's nice having another person to kind of like bounce some ideas off of and just take the reins. And, Cooper Schnurr was one of my favorite guests on the show so far, because honestly, I feel like if I didn't have anything to say, he'd fucking drum up something right away. And, it's rare having that kind of chemistry with people, and it's great to have it with friends. And I had a buddy in high school, and unfortunately him and I have since parted ways. But we had that kind of chemistry, and we actually had a show back in high school. Mark and Nick Go to Physics. It was, I don't think it ever made it to YouTube, but it was like on Facebook through all of our friends, and like a bunch of people at our high school watched it. I mean, a bunch being like 30 or 40 people, like not that many, but people in our class. But we made basically weekly videos, and we did it in our fucking physics class. Like, we would film it during our fucking class. Shout out Mr. Kowalik for letting us do that. But again, we had that kind of thing where you could just kind of riff and keep going and play off one another, and you're just not worried. There's just no concern. You feel so comfortable. You feel so at ease. You feel like there's this safety net now, or at least the feeling that if you go down, at least you're not going down alone. And you feel like you can take chances and say wild shit. And oh man, and there's so many podcasts. Again, History Hyena is another podcast of a podcast that I did. Giannis Pappas and Chris DiStefano, I mentioned them early on. Great chemistry. They did so well together, and it's really sad that they're not doing their podcast together anymore, because again, it was just creative chaos. And it's funny because Chrissy mentioned it too. He's like, when he's with Giannis, he's a different kind of person, but that person's fucking entertaining as fuck. And it's an interesting thing, and it's a beautiful thing to watch to watch it happen on Are You Garbage, to watch these two good buddies ask someone else too, right? Because kind of, there's times where sometimes someone might, take, or again, with H. Foley and Kippy feeling that they themselves are garbage, they tend to, feel a certain way, however the guest might answer the question. So they might, again, if it's matching up with their preconceived notions, they're usually happy. If it's not, they're usually like surprised. It's fucking classic human reaction. Haha. Yes, I am a robot observing human action, and that was one of them. No, but you know what I'm saying? Like, they they react in a hilarious way to all these guests' answers. And I think that chemistry really bleeds out. And again, it's funny when you see a guest that's on the show that clearly they haven't ever met before. You can see the kind of guard is up, and it's like, again, it's kind of set up like a game. So some people are a little bit more competitive than others, but you can kind of see slowly but surely the guard comes down and things get easy, because these guys just are two cool guys that you think you'd want to just have a fucking stogie with. I don't even smoke cigarettes, and I'd want to smoke a cigarette with these two guys. Hopefully they're not smoking anymore, boys. Thank you all so much for watching. Hopefully y'all enjoyed it, and hopefully you get a chance to go check out the Are You Garbage podcast. There's some fucking excellent guests. Just go find your favorite out of the mix and watch it. There's no rhyme or reason to the show. Just fucking get into it. Super cool anytime. It's been on for a few years, so you can go back in time and binge it. And just like the Bigmark podcast, go check out all of our old episodes too. You know, we're up to 134, I think, now. So again, thank you all so much for watching. Really appreciate y'all. Your time is valued. I really appreciate it. Check out our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpod. DM us on our Twitter or Instagram at @thebigmarkpod or at @thebigmarkpodcast. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe to the channel. Rate the podcast. Tell your friends. Love y'all. Peace.